You're watching The New Stack Makers, a podcast for people who develop, deploy, and manage at-scale software. For more information and articles about at-scale technologies, please visit thenewstack.io. Now enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the New Stack Makers podcast. I'm your host, Lorraine Lawson, reporter with the New Stack. And today we're going to talk about code reviews and how to make them work for your team. We're joined today by Adrienne Braganza Tacke, the Senior Developer Advocate and DevNet Community Program Lead with Cisco DevNet. Thanks for joining us today, Adrienne.
Thanks, Lorraine. It's nice to be here.
I'll be honest. I was afraid of this book because I thought it might be very technical and dry, but it's actually really a fun and fast read with lots of practical advice, but you cover so much. And so today I'd like to focus on the real core of the issue, how to make code reviews work. First, I thought it'd be good to start at the beginning and define a few terms. So fundamentally, what is a code review and what should it entail?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. And I actually appreciate you saying that it was a fun read and not a dry read. That was the hope. I also have a lot of technical books that I'm like, it's a pain to get through. So I wanted to make sure if I ever wrote one that it was not like that. So thank you for that. Yes, code review. It's this, at its core, it's this process that really anybody that writes code or reads code and has to work on a team goes through. And this process has, at the lowest common denominator, because it can be different on every team, has about 4 parts. So the catalyst for it even happening is that there's new code or changed code that needs to be looked at. When this code is ready, the person who wrote it, who we call the author, requests somebody else for it to be reviewed. So that's the second part of a code review, is the actual reviewing mechanism. During the review, someone who we call the reviewer will look through the code to make sure that it's okay, make sure that it works with the rest of the project, that it adheres to conventions, that it's pretty much safe to kind of put into the rest of the application. If it's not, that's where they have the third part commence, which is having feedback left on that code. So that can be in the form of comments, that can be in the form of notes, and you just kind of point out where in the code things might need to change or where things are wrong and ask the author to change that or address that feedback. After that cycle goes on for a little bit, the last part of the code review is it will be approved, basically. Some sign-off conditions are met. Those are usually set by the team. And the reviewer will then approve that code to be progressed onto the main code base. So if you want to think about code review, it's very similar to actually when you write a book and the copy editing process, where somebody takes a final look at it, they check for spelling or grammar issues, they make sure that it flows, they make sure that the different sections are in the correct spaces, all of those kinds of checks. It's very similar to what we do in code review, but for software and for software developers.
Yeah, I will say that it definitely reminded me of that process, that editorial process that, we work with at the New Stack. I am going to call it code review practice, though, because after reading your book, it's clear that it's something that teams sometimes have to redefine as they go. And full disclosure, my husband works at a small development shop, maybe 5 people. Turns out they don't do code review. Yeah. Which makes you wonder, do you have a sense for how common it is for development shops to even perform code reviews? Are there shops out there that aren't?
Well, surprisingly, yes. I can confidently say yes, though I don't have an exact number. I did a very quick search, and the most relevant thing I could find, there's a JetBrains State of the Developer Ecosystem, where they asked about, I believe it was 29 or 22,000 developers to self-respond to different questions. And about 53% of them did say they did code reviews. So I do know that there are devs who say they do it. That means there's another percentage there that does not. And through my travels and talks at conferences, I've spoken to lots of developer teams who also say, hey, we don't do code reviews, or hey, we don't do it in the way that you've been talking about. So we might as well, not count it as even doing a review. And it's still very, very surprising to me because at least in the jobs that I've been and in the teams that I've been on, that's something that has at least always existed in some bare form. But to have no code reviews at all, that's very scary to think about and also very surprising to hear. But I am not that surprised as I started to write this book and started to research why, because there are so many parts about the code review process that if it goes wrong or if it isn't set up properly or there's a lot of human factors in it that could make it go wrong, a lot of teams will just say, well, forget it. We're just not going to do it. This is a hindrance, a bottleneck. It doesn't bring the team the value that it should be bringing because of all these other negative things that could surround it.
Right. And part of that, what strikes me about that is that part of that may be that they are doing things in code review that they shouldn't be. You talk about that a little in the book, that you see maybe people go into defining new requirements in the code review or styles of code. So what should be excluded during a code review?
That's a good question. I think at a high level, there's three things. There's the very first thing is ambiguity. If you take a look at a lot of the parts in my book, it's all about being specific. So excluding ambiguity from the code review is really, really important because being ambiguous in your code review, in the way that you set it up, in the way that you describe it, in the description and the title of your pull request, to even how you talk to your colleagues about your code if you get into a conversation about it, being ambiguous leads to a lot of problems. You are confusing the reviewer. You go through so much more back and forth because you're not aligned on the code or what it is you're trying to ask. If things need to change, it could cause rework, and rework being done in the wrong way because you weren't clear about what it was. So ambiguity is like one of the number one things to completely exclude from the code review if you can be as explicit as possible. Number two is subjectivity. So a big issue in code reviews that people dread is to actually receive the feedback, right? So it is known as a process that is, or practice that is, very much a critique, and a lot of people don't like to have their code or themselves, how they feel about it, critiqued. And having that notion already in play, and then you as a reviewer being subjective about the type of feedback that you leave, makes it even more difficult for somebody to want to do a code review process. They're like, I don't want someone to, talk about my baby, this code, this perfect code that we've written and spent some time on, and feel like it's an extension of ourselves. So it's a responsibility that I write, that for the reviewers to be as objective as possible in their feedback. Why are you stating something is wrong? Can you back it up? Is there a better way to do something? Certainly bring that up in the code review, but don't say it just because you think it's the better way. Describe or justify why it is a better way to do something. Coming from that background, coming from an objective background in this case, rather than a subjective background, especially in the review process and the feedback process, will go so far in terms of keeping the team dynamics much better on your team and during code reviews. And then the last part of that is ego. Keep your ego out of the code review. I have seen so many times, I've experienced it myself, where there's just somebody who thinks they're, the greatest developer ever, and they use the code review as a way to just kind of put other developers down, or, every single review that they are asked to do, they use it as an opportunity to rewrite the code and say, this is how, this is a better way to do it, and then just go that way instead of starting a conversation or really working with the team. So ego has no place in the code review. If you take those three things out of the code review, ego, ambiguity, and subjectivity, I think a lot of teams will immediately start to see the benefits of that in their code review processes.
You wrote that this surprised me actually, that developers actually like code review once they've done it in a productive way. What did they like? What does it gain them?
So when they are done right and when they are, built, co-created, I would say, with the team, with everybody that participates, I think it can offer them the value and the benefits that I see. And that's why I'm trying to, advocate to the world that code reviews are the greatest thing. But what I think it earns them, the most important thing that it earns them is that they have a place to know how their project or their application has evolved over time. They have an official record of how changes have come to play. And that's really important in software development. It is changing all the time. Sometimes you have a new requirement that asks you to change one part of the project, and you do that very quickly. And then later on, maybe you might have a problem that happens in that area. Well, what happened in that area? How do we see if there's any cause there that might have come from that new requirement that was asked of us to be put in? I think having a very logical, chronological timeline of all the changes that have happened on your code base is very, very important. And that's one of the things teams like about this process is that they can use it as an official documenting record. And they can also tie every change that they've ever released as granularly as to every commit. So for every commit that has passed through, they can absolutely tell what has changed, what has not, what is affected. So that is one of the big benefits that I would think applies to the whole team. And, you're the team that's maintaining that code base. Anything that makes it easier to maintain that code base, to make it easy to develop against, to change, that's always a plus for teams. I think another thing that developers really like about it is that there's a lot of knowledge transfer and knowledge sharing that can happen in the code review process. So, for example, a very common one is, let's say, a junior developer asks for their code to be reviewed, and a senior developer very objectively, very nicely points out some things that they could do better, or they could improve in their code. That is a way for them to learn in a formal and structured format how to make their code better. They can learn, oh, this is the way our team does things, or this is a convention that I didn't know. Similarly, if you have a new team member that joins the team, and they don't necessarily have to be a new developer, they could be another senior developer, an experienced developer just joining a new team, there's a lot of things that you need to know. How does the team do things? What are their conventions? What are their standards? What are the things that they look out for, and how does it usually run in the code base? So again, a code review is the perfect spot for colleagues to kind of show them, here's what to do, here's why we do it, and here are the standards that you can apply moving forward. So in that sense, the knowledge transfer and the knowledge sharing that can happen in code reviews is really, really important. And that levels up the skill and the knowledge of the entire team, which is really important because there's this, factor, we call it they say the bus factor, but I like the vacation factor, which is if somebody goes on vacation and they're the only person that had any knowledge about a specific part of a project, you kind of are stuck if something happens in that part of the project. You don't necessarily want to call that developer who's on vacation to bother them, right? So instead of having that siloed knowledge only belong to a single person or a single developer, it's better to spread that knowledge around, especially if it's core knowledge that the whole team should know. So knowledge sharing and knowledge transfer allows for that to happen on a team, to not have any single person be the keeper of this important knowledge.
You talked about in the book about your own experience with the small coding shop where you would sort of toss everything over the wall to quality assurance and then be upset if they didn't catch problems. I love these personal stories. You realize at some point that it was you who had the wrong mindset. And I think that's a very profound realization that, maybe a lot of people don't always have these realizations. Can you just explain that situation and how you came to see it in the end and how your realization relates to code review as a practice?
Absolutely. I'm not happy about this, but I am happy that I learned about it early enough in my career. There was a shop that I was working on, very small, 4 people, had 2 developers, one quality assurance engineer, and one quality assurance person who would do the manual testing. The other one was writing unit tests and automation tests. And so in this team, we would do our tasks, we would work on our assigned tasks, and the process was once we were done with them, we would send them over to quality assurance and for them to manually test, and they would be the reviewers in this case. They would say yes, it works, or no, it doesn't, and that would be how it would progress forward if they approved it. So in this time, I was very much of the mindset that once I was finished with the last piece of code that I wrote, that was the end of my job, that I would throw it over the cubicle literally to my coworker, and it is their job to find anything that was wrong with it. Everything that was missing, anything that I didn't catch, any edge cases I wasn't thinking of, I really truly felt that was their job to find. And even though I felt that, I also simultaneously felt if they did actually send it back to me, I would be upset. Like, "Oh, really? No, it's not. It's perfect. What do you mean you found something?" So, this was a very big realization for me because when I started to get more and more things sent back over to me, or when I would have things pass through quality assurance and something would still happen, something would break in production, that was something that I needed to reflect on and say, well, why isn't this caught? Or why wasn't this going as smoothly as I thought? And a big realization I had was that just because it goes through this other person and just because they say that it is okay, it doesn't mean I had fully made sure on my end that I had done everything I could to make sure the code I was passing through was correct. So the lessons that I learned from this particular time was that number one, I was not using any type of automation at all to help myself, meaning are there any things I could fix? A lot of the things I got sent back were silly issues that would cause things to not work. So if I had my own set of automation, say unit tests that I could run, or a syntax checker in my IDE, these are all things that I could take care of. These are things that could be my responsibility and should have been my responsibility to fix. And that's a big part of what I write about in the book is that there are a lot of things that get to the code review stage that have feedback left on them that should never make it to the code review stage. You waste time looking at these what I call smaller stakes issues, and really they are things that should be fixed and can be fixed during the development stage, during the time that you're writing the code. So that was one big lesson I learned there. The other lesson I learned was that there's a bit of ego there, right? I was the developer. They were the quality assurance person who was just testing something. So maybe if they found something wrong, maybe they were wrong. So that was a very big ego check for myself that no, I did not write perfect code every single time. No, when they did find something, that doesn't mean that it was something small or insignificant. It was something major. If they were testing through what we call the happy path, the core things that should be working, and something didn't work, like I should be embarrassed that it didn't work. I should have felt that it should have never made it to that point. So that was another lesson for me to say, look, just because I'm a developer or whatever the makeup of the team was, and just because I'm the one writing the code, doesn't mean I'm better than anybody else. Doesn't mean that I always wrote perfect code, that there was always room for improvement for my things. And then the last thing that I learned there was really to be my own first reviewer. It matches the automation aspect, but in this case, being able to go through my code and try to anticipate what somebody else would see or find or possibly point out and say, why did you do it this way? Or why is this not adhering to some sort of standard? That was something I took with me, and what I talk about also in the book, which is if you are able to do your own review and you can do it as many times as you need to, that's again another chance for you to improve the actual code that you finally send up to the reviewer. And in a code review, many people might not want to hear it or know it just like I did it, but we should be setting up the reviewers for success. So this is the analogy I'm trying to make, is that when authors send up their code to be reviewed, it's very similar to how I just threw over my code over the cubicle. We kind of throw over the code to the reviewer and say, here, find everything that's wrong. And, my job is done. The moment I'm done writing code, the job is done. The job is not done at that point. We need to look at our code. We need to review it as many times as possible. We need to make sure all the context that we've been working with is filled in the pull request and adding that to the description. We need to set the reviewer up for success, essentially. As much information we can share about the code should be given to the reviewer, and as much anything that we can do to make our code better and to do as many self-checks as possible before the code review will actually make the code review more productive, because then the reviewer is not wasting time on those smaller stakes issues. They can actually spend the reviewing time looking for those higher stakes issues that we don't hope to find them, but that's what we intend to use the code review for.
I can see how code review would be sort of challenging in some ways for the developer themselves. But in addition to sort of, learning that maybe you're not perfect in this process, there are specific triggers that organizations can create inadvertently, or the reviewer can create, that can cause developers to circumvent the process entirely, which of course sabotages the outcome of code review. Would you talk a bit about what happens that causes people to not buy into the process?
Oh, absolutely. So we talked about some initial ones there, which is if there's no enforcement on the human side, we just let the developers with egos run rampant. That completely destroys the dynamic of your team. No, people will either just say, yes, everything looks great and not look at it properly, or they avoid the process completely because they don't want to deal with a specific reviewer who's very harsh in their code reviews. So that's something to look out for. There's a whole chapter which I think answers this question. Then I talk about loopholes. And if you see any of these, be aware of that, because these are what would cause developers to go around it. So there is such a thing as too much code review, right? So we talk about the benefits of code review, but there have been some teams I've been on where the process was so stringent, so many steps, so many approvals, so many things to do that it actually was too cumbersome. The overall benefits of going through the review and actually having somebody find it was outweighed by how many steps you had to do. And so again, if people have to go through so many steps, or they get, you could say lazy, but in this case, there were like 6 to 7 additional steps that I felt were not necessary. Um, Anytime you make it a little bit harder for someone unnecessarily, then people will find a way to go around it. So they will either, again, just avoid it or try to shortcut some of those things, which is where problems can be introduced, or where the process itself won't be done properly because they're skipping a couple steps. That's something to look out for. Another loophole to look out for is sometimes you have a couple developers who are buddies, right? And not saying it's wrong to have friends at work, but in this case, for code reviews, sometimes they are the ones that kind of just give each other their code to look at. They only review each other's code, and they only approve each other's code. So it's kind of like, hey, you approve mine and I'll approve yours. And they're the only people who ever do the review or whoever look at the code that they write. This is a problem because this is obviously some bias, right? If you only have the same person looking at that code and always approving that code for that matter, then you may not be getting a full objective review of that code. Another problem here is that if it's only that same person ever looking, you don't share that knowledge across the rest of the team. So now you're introducing some siloed knowledge between the two of you or the three of you, whoever that group tends to be that are just approving each other's code. That's another big issue, is that you trap that knowledge between those specific people and you don't get that knowledge out to the rest of the team. And I think the last loophole I'll talk about before I just share everything, the last loophole I'll talk about is I always talk about using automation. That's a great thing, especially during code reviews. But one loophole is sometimes you don't configure your tools correctly, or you don't configure the tools after an emergency situation. So that's a bonus loophole. There's sometimes production breaks, there's a fire happening, and obviously the first thing you want to do is just to fix it, right? You want to fix it and get it over with. And sometimes that is used to skip the code review process. No, we need to fix this emergency right now. So let's just skip it. Let's just push the code straight to production and be good with it. And that's a problem because either folks will start to use emergency situations to kind of skip the code review process over and over again to the point that that's now the norm rather than the exception. So there is room for possibly bypassing the code review process if there is an emergency, but that needs to be a fully documented, full structured process on how to do that and what you're skipping, and a lot of communication that goes into that if you are going to do that. That's one part. And then the other part was the tools being misconfigured. So you could have some policies that you intend to enforce, but sometimes they're just not actually set up in the tools. So for example, you might say you could never approve your own pull requests, which is something I say you should not do. I could encourage teams never to allow that. And that could be the intent. But if you never set it up in your tool, then someone can still do it. And that's a loophole, again, that someone could use to bypass the proper process. So there are many loopholes. I'm sure there are more than what I talk about in my book, but anything that allows you to take shortcuts or anything that drives developers to be, to want to take shortcuts. Those are the things that you should keep an eye out for, especially as a tech lead or a manager, to make sure that code reviews are done in a proper way.
Let's talk about setting up code review as a team practice. Who should be involved in code review? What roles do you sort of need at a minimum for successful code review?
So I think this is a great question because a lot of teams probably just join and there's either a process in place and it's all right, it's working, but they know it could be better, or you're starting out beautifully on a green field, right? You could make it what you want it to be. And in this case, or in both cases, really, I think the entire team should be a part of creating this process. I talk about this in my book where if you want the process to work for your entire team, everybody needs to play a part in it. And so I walk through how to actually build that process from start to finish or to redo it. So the major parts there are, first, you need to talk as a team and you need to align on what are your actual goals for the code review? Why do you want to do this? And some of the ones that I suggest, some of the more common ones are maybe you want to keep a record of all the things that have changed in your code review. Maybe you want to do knowledge transfer and knowledge sharing, like I've mentioned earlier. Maybe you want to do some mentoring. There are different types of goals and they're going to be different for every team. So aligning on what those goals are is the first step. The next part of that is, now what do you actually want the code review process to do? How strict do you want it to be? All of the parameters that we kind of assume everybody knows or our colleagues know, I call them the implicit expectations. We should make those explicit. So there's this document I talk about creating called the Team Working Agreement. And I don't think it will solve every team's problems, but I think it's pretty close, at least for code reviews. And I suggest, after having all these conversations and debates and finally coming to a conclusion on what they want as a team and what they want for their code review and what the process should be like and what policies they're going to enforce, that should all be discussed and then explicitly made and brought out and written in this document. And this document is what I call a living document. Just because they write it that first time, doesn't mean that's the law for the team for the rest of time. This can change as their team changes, as their process changes, as the project changes. There's an evolution to this agreement, just like there's an evolution to any team that works together for a really long time. But by having all of these things spelled out in such a document, it's, number one, a referenceable thing that you can pull up. So let's say you have a standard that you've listed in the team working agreement. If somebody has an issue or wants to debate that in a code review, you can always bring up, hey, look, we all discussed and decided this is the standard, and we've written this in our team working agreement. So that's an objective form of argument that you can use if you have to use that in a code review. Another part of the team working agreement is that everybody is allowed and should be a co-author of that agreement, just like everybody is a co-creator of the process that they're trying to create. So to answer that particular question, everybody that writes code and reads code and will review code should be part of that process. And I guess the only exception I'll make there is if you have a tech lead or a tech manager who may not necessarily do any of those things, but is still an important part of your team, they should absolutely be part of that as well, because they could be doing the other parts that you don't see. They could be the ones promoting a code review culture. They could be the ones saying, this is what's important to us, or these are the standards we need to align to. This is how we want to conduct ourselves as a team. So pretty much the core development team should be part of the process when it comes to creating their code review process or refining it or updating it.
Well, we could talk about this all day, I feel like, because your book is just very deep and thorough. The title is Looks Good to Me, Constructive Code Reviews, correct?
That is correct.
By Meep? What's Meep?
That's a good question. So Meep is, my publisher is Manning Publications, and Meep is their Manning Early Access Program. So as I wrote my book, it was actually available as in the Early Access Program. So if you were somebody that purchased it initially, you may have read it when it was 3 chapters in, completely scrambled. You saw all of my jumbled thoughts and all of that. But now I'm actually finished with it. So if you were to go to the Meep area, you could get the entire book there. Right now, it's actually going through the final stages of copy editing, of typesetting, all of those things, all of the exciting things before it gets sent to print. So yes, not part of the title, but certainly it was available as I was writing it. And the other good thing about that, what I really appreciated, was this early access program also allows anybody that did read it to leave feedback. So that was very helpful for me in the creation of the book. Was I going on and on about something on one area? Was I missing something? Was an example not making sense? Was a, arbitrary funny joke or reference I was making not hitting? Those types of things were all part of the feedback. And I'm very, very grateful for everybody that has left feedback, because it has made the book so much better.
Well, again, I just want to say the title is Looks Good to Me, Constructive Code Reviews. It is available for Manning right now in electronic format, if you're curious. And will soon be available in print. That's all for this episode. We'd like to thank Adrienne for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was great being here.
I'm Lorraine Lawson for the New Stack Makers, and thank you, viewers, for joining us today.
If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.